In the last 2 weeks, we have seen how we, the Church, wrestled in thought and prayer during our early centuries to give an account of the definitive event that had happened in Judea and Galilee and been foretold in the Hebrew Scriptures. We have seen how, as the Church reflected on what had happened, we came to see that there was a profound tension in the heart of this story. For it seemed to us that the Father was God, the Son was God, and the Spirit was God, yet we knew there was but one God. Many different ways were tried to boil these two down into one manageable, cut and dried way of thinking, but each time somebody came up with a way that seemed to make sense. Son and Spirit are just different modes or aspects of the Father. Son and Spirit are created or adopted by the Father. There was always someone to say, no, that does not do justice to the immense reality that has been revealed to us. Back and forward, conflict and controversy, and in the end, what was left standing was the homoousion. Father, Son, and Spirit are distinct, yet of one being. And by the time the Nicene Creed was put into its final form at Constantinople in 381, through the conflict between orthodox and heretic, our language and ideas had been pushed and stretched to the point where we could, falteringly, begin to make sense of this. Now our focus shifts. A few decades have passed, and we have left the eastern shore of the Mediterranean and the rocky uplands of Asia Minor, turning instead to the Latin-speaking world of the Middle Mediterranean, Italy, and the ancient Roman colonies in North Africa. Here we find a world in which there is less controversy and more speculation. There is less need to defend the Nicene settlement and more space to contemplate what it means in detail. Here we find Augustine, perhaps the most influential Christian thinker there has ever been. Augustine came late to faith, led a rackety early life, was steeped in the thought of Plato, and owed much to the persistent good influence of his long-suffering and faithful mother. His output is immense and covers a lot of territory. Such is the power of his work today that the tremendously important text we are dipping into, on the Trinity, De Trinitate, is yet not the most influential of his books. But it is in this book that we find the first statement of what has come to be, at least in the Western Church, the definitive working out of Trinitarian doctrine. Next week, we fast forward 1,000 years. We will be struck by how little has changed, by how well Augustine stands the test of time. As with all the great Trinitarian writers, a summary does not do justice to the book. Why? Well, because the great Trinitarian writers cannot use the language they start with. They have to make new words and concepts, and this means going over and over the same territory, crisscross in many directions, until the new words and the new ways of using words come to life. Remember, we are trying to say something about the unsayable, so it's going to be hard to summarize. With that in mind, let me offer you a ruthless summary. When you read the set text, and more widely in De Trinitate, you will find much that I do not cover here, and that is all to the good. Do not let me close off your reading. But this may help you notice things and put them in order in your mind. I want to point out two important things that Augustine gives us. The first is his use of the notion of divine simplicity. Divine simplicity. The second is what we call the psychological analogies. We'll look at them in that order, and the first will take us longer because it's harder. Divine simplicity. The first thing to grasp is that simple here means something that we will not find simple at all. Please get the normal meaning of simple that you're used to out of your head right now. You're not in Kansas anymore. For us, simple is a technical term in classical and medieval philosophy. To be simple is to be one, unified, unchangeable. To be simple is, as you might say, to be what you have. God is simple, so God's love is not just a surface property of God, it is who God is. If we speak rightly, we don't say God is loving, we say God is love. Simplicity in this sense is mixed up with a couple of other philosophical terms, which we also need to get to grips with: substance and accident. The substance of a thing is that which it unalterably is all the way down, as it were. The accidents are those transient qualities that we experience from time to time. So you could say of me that I am made in the image of God, and I think that would be true of me substantially. you would be saying something about my substance, speaking of me, as Augustine says, according to substance. Then again, 30 years ago, you could have said of me that I had hair on my head, but now you probably wouldn't say that. The hair is thus an accident, and you speak of my hairiness or otherwise according to accident. Clear so far? Now, when you speak of me, you may possibly be speaking according to substance, but you will usually be speaking according to accident, because I am changeable, mortal, sometimes hairy and sometimes not. But when we speak of God, we speak only according to substance. God is simple, unalterable, wholly consistent, eternal. Whatever is true of God is no mere glancing momentary accident, it is true all the way down. So that's our key terminology. God is simple, and we can now explain this in terms of our other two words. God has no accidental properties. All that we say of God, we say according to substance. Augustine did not invent these terms, but he baptizes them and brings them fully into our minds, and we have been working with them ever since. And so far, they do not seem to solve our problem. For how can the Son and the Father be of one substance, and yet one of them is begotten and the other begets? I mean, look at it this way. I am a father. My son, Paddy, whom you met in the last video, is not. Both of these things are accidentally true. Our relationship one to another changes. A quarter of a century ago, I was not a father. It's all accident, which is what you would expect, because neither Paddy nor I is simple. But God is simple. In God, everything is according to substance, not accident. So it must be in the substance, surely, of the Father to be a father, and in the substance, surely, of the Son to be a son. It cannot be that the Father is a father by accident, or the Son a son by accident. But then, how can they be of one and the same substance? It is in giving an answer to this question that Augustine comes up with a concept of great depth and importance. Yes, says Augustine, the Father and the Son and the Spirit are of one being or substance, and the Father is Father and the Son is Son. But the Father's fatherness is not accidental, it is relational. He says this, although to be the Father and to be the Son is different, yet their substance is not different, because they are so called not according to substance, but according to relation, which relation, however, is not accident, because it is not changeable. The relationship that distinguishes one person of the Trinity from another is a relationship with another being who is also simple. So the relationship does not alter. The Father is eternally Father because eternally he has a Son. The Son is eternally Son because eternally he has a Father. Father and Son are one being, one substance, but they are distinct by virtue of their relationship one with another. This is big stuff, and it may take a few weeks for it to sink in. Sit with it. But whilst you sit, notice that from this central insight a number of other exciting things pop into view. For instance, the distinct personhood, hypostasis, as the Greeks say, of the Father is in virtue of the Son and vice versa, and both in virtue of the Spirit, and again vice versa. Each is God, but each is who he is in virtue of the eternal relationship with the other two. As Augustine says, neither is in respect to himself alone, and both exist relatively the one to the other. And one more example of the kind of exciting idea that pops out of Augustine's use of divine simplicity. Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. We know this because it jumps off the pages of Scripture. But now, with this notion of divine simplicity in mind, we see into it a little further. The Son is the Father's wisdom and power. That goes both ways. The Son is wisdom and power begotten of the Father. And the Father is wise and powerful in virtue of having the Son. The power, wisdom, goodness, and love of God are the power, wisdom, goodness, and love of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And there is only one power, wisdom, and goodness. But the power, wisdom, goodness, and love of each is that of the others. Each receives, each gives. If this is sounding a little bit like Gregory of Nazianzus and his notion of perichoresis, well, there might be something in that. There's so much more to unpack from this wonderful notion of divine simplicity, and I encourage you to keep coming back to Augustine. As I said, he will resurface next week when we read Anselm and Thomas, and will be the background to all our conversations. For now, though, we need to touch more briefly on one other key thing we get from Augustine, the psychological analogies. Psychological analogies. Augustine says, citing Genesis 1:26, that we are made in the image of God. Therefore, he says, we may expect to find the image of God in ourselves and in the world around us, marred and confused to a greater or lesser degree by sin, but there. It cannot tell us anything certain about God. All that we can know about God is what God reveals, not what we deduce. Nevertheless, there must be echoes of the Creator in the created, and it does us good to look into them. So Augustine notices a lot of different situations in which we see three distinct things, each of which is not itself except for its relationship with the other two, and each of which is the whole of what it is when taken together with the other two. He gives us several examples, and we shall consider a few more that he doesn't give on Monday night. But the one that has most caught the imagination, and which very much colours the Trinitarian thought that comes down to us from the medievals, is the example of memory, understanding, and will. Remember that. Memory, understanding, and will. Reflect, please, on what is going on as you yourself seek to master this hard topic of Trinitarian doctrine. Think of the part played in this by memory, understanding, and will. To get this stuff, all you need to do is remember everything we talk about. And all you need do is understand what we talk about. And all you need do is will yourself to concentrate. Yet, if you do not remember, you cannot understand. If you do not will to learn, you cannot remember, and so on. Then think of this. Days when your will is weak because you are tired or anxious, is not your memory and your understanding impaired? Times when your understanding is weak, when you are tired or overworked, is it not harder to remember? And can you not sometimes, by an effort of will, yet make yourself understand and remember? Each on its own is the whole of your learning self, yet none of the three is without its interconnection with the others. Sounds familiar? Augustine says we may be warranted in letting what we see when we look within give body to our notions of God as Trinity. What do you say to that? So, those are the two key points I want you to bear in mind as you reread Augustine, his use of the notion of divine simplicity and his psychological analogies. Let me just say a few words in conclusion about how we read him. Augustine is working with some concepts that were familiar then but alien to us now, the distinction between substance and accident, for instance. So we have to make an effort to understand him, which his contemporaries did not. Let us make that effort. Also, he is struggling with this himself. He is the first person to speak these thoughts. First goes are messy. The Northern Line from Stockwell to Bank is not as comfortable as the Dubai Metro built 120 years later. Augustine can be a bumpy ride too. Forgive him and work with him. As you read, ask yourself and Augustine a few questions. What does he mean by substance, essence, and ousia, terms he seems to use fairly interchangeably? What does it mean for the Son to be image, word, wisdom of the Father? What must that mean if we are also to say that Son and Father are alike and equally God? And when we get into chapter 11, use your own memory, understanding, and will, your own experience of being your memory, understanding, and will, to test whether what Augustine says stacks up. Remember, you don't have to agree with him. If you find him wrong or confused, say so. You may be right, or you may be wrong, but have the argument with him. For my money, for instance, he is mistaken about how language works, too hung up on specific words rather than broad concepts, and the stuff about the differences between Latin and Greek terminology doesn't much help us either. Leave that on one side if you like. But please, simply read. Steep yourselves in the wonderful, mysterious, and I think God-given wisdom by which Augustine at last starts to put into words that which has defied articulation for 400 years. I look forward to hearing what you make of it.